For my topic discussion, I wanted to share some thoughts based on some recent experiences I've had with friends who are new to board gaming, or at least to hobby board gaming. More than one person recently has asked me what games I would recommend they play, knowing that I have gone deeper in the rabbit hole that is hobby board gaming. I asked them what board games they like and have played to kind of get a feel for what they have experienced already. The answer was pretty much the same for all of them, which was I've played and really enjoy Catan, or Ticket to Ride, and classic or modern classic games like that. So that inspired me as I was coming up with answers for them on the fly. I reflected on that after the fact and wanted to create a more definitive list for me personally so I could offer some better recommendations in the future and to help people experience more of what hobby board gaming has to offer if they do indeed want to dive further into the hobby and see what is there. In addition to recommending general board games across the board, I wanted to recommend Uwe Rosenberg games as well to be their next step as well, as it kind of reflects not only how diverse his repertoire is and how they can fit into many people's gaming groups, but it also essentially follows my own board gaming journey, as I jumped straight into Rosenberg's games after becoming familiar with some of these more classic games. To explain, and I've probably explained this on the podcast before, but I was very familiar with games such as Pandemic and some of the more thematic games like Lord of the Rings, the living card game, Mansions of Madness, Betrayal and House on the Hill, etc. Those were some of the games that I was playing more often before I discovered Euro games, I suppose, but also hobby games in general, designer board games, if you will. To me beforehand, it didn't really occur to me that a lot of these board games that I had been playing were by designers who create different board games, every year or so. And so when I had first discovered Agricola, I really loved the theme of it and everything. I've gone into that in more depth in the past before. But then I discovered that this designer, Uwe Rosenberg, not only had designed a game that I had played years in the past with Bonanza, but other games that were very similar to Agricola, like Caverna and A Feast for Odin, etc. And it was around that time, too, it was back in 2020, when Hallertau was about to be announced and released, that's when I started to really pay attention to the news, into what board games were coming out, paying attention to what designers and publishing companies were doing with these board games. And so I kind of jumped into the deep end, going from games like Pandemic straight into Agricola, which may work for me. There may be other people out there that it may work for as well, and so therefore I am recommending some of these Rosenberg games that could get you to that point faster. But I understand that not everyone would want to make that huge jump. And so I do want to make some other recommendations from my own personal play experience that makes sense if you do enjoy some of these more classic games, to create a little bit more diversity in the same complexity rate, but also to hopefully help people become more familiar with the mechanisms that at first may be more complex, but in my opinion add a lot more depth and replayability to these games, which equates to a lot more fun. And perhaps if people enjoy that, they can further explore and perhaps land on some Rosenberg games themselves. So let's give this a shot. So the first game that I wanted to talk about that people have often played, the number one game that people mention to me when they have played a board game recently that they love, is Catan. And that is no surprise to anyone. So first of all, my Rosenberg pick for recommendations if someone loves Catan is actually Glass Road. The reason I feel like this game works as a recommendation is that there are similar mechanisms at play, with resource management and tableau building and spatial consideration. Catan's quote-unquote tableau is the main board that everyone interacts on, while Glass Road's tableau is individual. Also, both games offer some sort of simultaneous play, as well as a turn-based action selection throughout both games. In Catan, everyone is gaining resources based off of the dice roll, thus helping players feel engaged at all times and thinking about what they might do on their turn. And players take turns building tiles or playing cards on their respective turns. In Glass Road, the same happens when everyone simultaneously chooses cards to play from their turn, and you go around playing those cards one by one with some simultaneous interaction here and there. I'm not going to go into a lot of the rules differences or rules overviews for these games, by the way. Just hopefully you do understand these games at a somewhat core level, and hopefully it makes sense to you, and you can look further into these games to see what similarities you find. But back to Catan and Glass Road, I think these two games culminate in a way that feels similar in how you approach the game based off of these similarities and mechanisms. You are aware of what other players want and are doing, and there's plenty of player interaction in both games, in my opinion. In Glass Road, it may be a little bit more complex with the rules, but as soon as you understand those rules, even though it might seem like it is more multiplayer solitaire, with the tableau building that you have, picking off buildings and placing them onto your board, the interaction that you have with other players in that game by somewhat predicting what cards they may be able to play, to be able to play more cards from your hand during each round, rather than sticking with only 3 of them, but encourages you to be aware of what other players might be doing on their own individual tableaus, thus potentially predicting what you should play from your hand to potentially gain extra efficient actions during your turn. The one thing that is missing from Glass Road that is found in Catan is straight up negotiation, where you can trade cards from your hand, resources from your hand to someone else to enable things further. There's a lot of fluidity in that regard, and so as a side pick, if you do enjoy the negotiation portion of Catan more than perhaps some of the other parts of it combined, then I would recommend Bonanza. I think Bonanza does a great job of putting that negotiation forward and creating more of a social, interactive experience that I feel like Catan offers as a Eurogame that is somewhat unique amongst Eurogames today. I feel that Catan, by creating that social interaction, the fluidity, and the kind of non-scripted approach to that comes with negotiation games, and perhaps I'm not referring to the more competitive scene, but on a more casual level, that aspect is, I think, apparent in Bonanza and not in Glass Road. But if you want the more mechanical representations outside of negotiation, I think you can find some similarities between Catan and Glass Road. Obviously, Glass Road offering more of that Rosenberg style of Euro mechanisms of different buildings having different costs to them and different actions that they can do and objectives that you can obtain with a little bit more diversity than you would find in Catan. But I think, there are a lot of similarities between both games. My non-Rosenberg board game pick for those who love Catan is actually Earth. Once again, some of the mechanisms are similar. You have simultaneous play, you have interactive experiences in the sense that it is positive in Earth, where you are paying attention to other players' turn. There's relatively little downtime as you wait in Earth for players to choose an action and for you to take a sub-action of that action that someone chose on your own and performing that on your tableau. And so it keeps people engaged, it keeps people somewhat interactive as well, because in my experience, the positive interaction that comes with someone choosing an action and everyone allowed to take that action at a subset of the power creates a dynamic where you're hoping people take a certain action and you are communicating that over the table. And so it's not directly said in words like it is in Catan, where negotiation is a something that is explained in the rulebook, whereas in Earth it is developed because of what the mechanisms are in play. But in kind of a sense, there's the tableau building, the interaction, the simultaneous play that creates a more social experience than some other Euro games out there. And so for me, and the complexity isn't as intense as I would expect for someone to jump from Catan to some other Euro game. And so I do believe that Earth is a good next step for those who do enjoy Catan. Next on the list is Carcassonne. My Rosenberg pick for Carcassonne is Framework. Now, a lot of the polyomino or tile placement games that Rosenberg has made, such as Nova Luna and others, may work here as well, but I think my favorite of the bunch is Framework, and I think that one fits most closely with Carcassonne. Carcassonne is defined as a tile drafting game with spatial consideration for where you place those tiles in a shared board. Once again, with Rosenberg's games, there isn't a shared board, but the tile drafting feels similar, and the ever-increasing options on where to place those tiles in conjunction with what is already placed in order to fulfill objectives feels rather similar to Carcassonne. And so I think you can make a few different comparisons here and have the same complexity as well for rules and strategy and what have you. And I think Carcassonne, to those who play Carcassonne, Framework would feel pretty similar in how it plays in a more individual level rather than in a shared board. And for my non-Rosenberg pick, I choose Cascadia. This is a very cozy tile placement game that I feel shares the competitive aspect of Carcassonne, where you are trying to fulfill objectives in a sense, where, like in Carcassonne, you're trying to place tiles and put your meeples into locations on the board, like in cities or what have you, in order to reap from those benefits. Whereas in Cascadia, those objectives are public and everyone can fulfill them, but you are drafting those tiles in order to gain those benefits ahead of your other opponents. You can pay attention to what other players are doing and potentially hate draft them in what you grab from the market row in Cascadia, even though that the tableaus are individual based. But that kind of cutthroat hate drafting aspect in a rather cozy setting can be seen in both games. I think Carcassonne can be played rather casually as well, and Cascadia obviously can be as well. And so I recommend Cascadia for the next step if the group has only played Carcassonne. Next, Ticket to Ride, another very popular game, and this one for Rosenberg's pick is interesting for me, and that is Mercator. Mercator is an older game by Uwe Rosenberg that might seem like a stretch, but hear me out. I feel like Mercator offers some of the same interactive experiences that Ticket to Ride offers. In both games, the goal of the game is to fulfill objectives. In Ticket to Ride, those are the cards that you grab at the beginning of the game and potentially draft throughout the remainder of the game as well, where you are fulfilling routes by placing trains onto the board and creating a seamless line from one end to another to fulfill those objectives. In Mercator, it's not as linear. You acquire different objectives throughout the game in the forms of cards as well, but the resources that you grab do not come from a deck of cards like they do in Ticket to Ride. They come from a shared interactive board. And the point of interaction here is somewhat similar. Meaning to say that there is some interaction in both games. Mercator is strictly not a heads-down multiplayer solitaire experience. In Ticket to Ride, you may be cutting off people from cards that they want to draw from the market row, or certain lines that they may want to play their train tiles or train pieces on. There are obviously some alternative routes that you can use in Ticket to Ride, but in all, it is more of a cutthroat experience, versus in Mercator, in that shared board when you are traveling across the map of Europe. If you are in the same area as another player and they move to a new spot on the board, you have the option to tag along with them and spend another resource, which is time in this game, to travel with them and to reap the benefits that they are taking from that new area that they're going to, and to collect those resources and fulfill your own objectives. And so the interaction it feels a little bit different than it does in Ticket to Ride, but the overall objective of objective fulfilling feels the same. And because of that and the shared board, I think this is the closest game that would come to Ticket to Ride, is Mercator. And my non-Rosenberg pick is the number one board game on Board Game Geek right now, which is Brass. Birmingham specifically, but Lancashire would fulfill this requirement as well. This is definitely a step up in complexity, and I suppose a lot of Martin Wallace's train games and other train games out there, like, from Wallace Age of Steam or Steam and other train games, perhaps even 18xx games, might be a next step for those who enjoy Ticket to Ride. Maybe too large of a step, but specifically with Brass, you are playing cards from your hand, just like you are with Ticket to Ride. There is hand management, there is route building, there's a lot of interaction in where these routes are. Once again, there is a little bit of cutthroatness to where you might be placing these routes to steal points from other players as you build those routes, but also to have the opportunity to build in certain cities before other people do. So there is that kind of negative aspect, but there's also the positive aspect of building a route and being able to use someone else's route to build in a city from which you might have not been able to do so previously. And so lots of interaction, paying attention to what other people are doing on the board, keeping you engaged, and with the theme of trains as well being somewhat similar in both games, I think Ticket to Ride lovers would potentially really enjoy Brass if they are looking for an additional challenge. The next game is Pandemic. Now, some of these comparisons and recommendations become more unhinged as we go along, so bear with me. But my pick for someone who enjoys Pandemic and wants to play a Rosenberg game is Le Havre. This is a stretch, but as Rosenberg does not have any co-op games to my knowledge. But Le Havre is his most popular game that involves a little bit of cooperation and interaction, in the sense that in Le Havre, you have a market of building cards that you can acquire, right? They contribute towards your overall wealth, which is how you score victory points and determine the winner at the end of the game. But the fact is that once you've acquired a building, it's not only yours to keep, or at least to use. Other people can use the building as well, typically for a cost. But that forces you to keep track of where buildings are, who owns them, and allows you to go and use other people's resources and intelligence, as it were. Thus, making the comparison to Pandemic, where in a cooperative nature, you are utilizing the cards in other people's hands, the events that they might have, the player powers that they harbor as well to accomplish an overall goal that is shared among the players. So obviously, with Le Havre, it is not cooperative. There's only one winner, but the fact that you can use other people's buildings and go to them and use what they have in front of them feels like the interaction that is found in Pandemic. And also, as an honorable mention for Rosenberg pick, this is seen in Or et Labora as well, the interaction with building tiles that are on other people's tableaus. Le Havre is a more popular game, it's probably more accessible, but Or et Labora is also out there in case you want to try that. So my non-Rosenberg pick for a recommendation for those who love Pandemic is a tough one to make because I have not played this game myself yet. But from what I have gathered from other people, if you're looking for a very enjoyable cooperative experience with some narrative, and so this is kind of dipping into, say, Pandemic Legacy, which a lot of people that I talk to have played. They've played the base game and they've gone into the Legacy version of it, and so there's a story aspect to the game. And from what I can gather, I think Sleeping Gods is a great next step for the folks who want a cooperative experience with a lot of narrative as well, keeping the complexity of the mechanisms at hand to a minimum. And so I can't say much more other than from what other people have said, that Sleeping Gods is an amazing experience, very reminiscent of, say, an open world experience that you have in games like video games like Zelda, Breath of the Wild, etc. And so that would be my next option and recommendation, even though I have not partaken in of it as well. I hope to soon in the future to see what kind of comparisons there are. Actually, an honorable mention that I will mention here are the living card games from like Fantasy Flight, such as Lord of the Rings, the living card game, Arkham Horror, and Marvel Champions. I think they are very much cooperative in nature. There may be a little bit of a shared resource utilization as you see in Pandemic. However, I am going to use this a little bit later on as a recommendation, so I'll hold more of my thoughts on living card games for later. Next is Wingspan. Now, Wingspan obviously has made quite a hit in the board gaming world in the 5 years or so that it has been out. And my comparison and my Rosenberg pick has to be my favorite Rosenberg of all time, which is Agricola. They share the fact that there are a huge amount of cards in both games that you can draw from. In Agricola, it can be random, it can be drafted as well. Wingspan, it is not. but the sheer amount of diversity that you have in those cards, with a lot of the bird cards as well as the cards in Agricola offering widely and individualistic abilities, make each game feel different and also allow you to create different engines and different combos with the cards that are dealt to you, making each game feel very different, in fact. And so Wingspan, I think, has been a game that has been widely more popular, more available in mass market type of situations and stores. And so if people want a little bit more of an edge to their game, creating more of a Euro-style experience with worker placement, yet keeping the variability and perhaps the coziness of, selling the theme as it is a farming style game where you're building out your farm, not really mentioning how tight it can be. But, I've had a lot of experience and success in people who have played Wingspan before enjoying Agricola. And so that is my pick for that. And then my non-Rosenberg pick, I think, may be obvious. There are a lot of similar Wingspan games out there, but my personal pick is Ark Nova. I feel like Ark Nova may soon, at one point, eventually become as popular and widespread as Wingspan, even though it is a harder game to learn and teach, and it is a longer game as well. I think the theme of Ark Nova, as well as the similarities in the sheer amount of cards, as well as the decision branching that this game offers, or both games offer, where Wingspan is distilled down to 4 actions that you can take each turn. Ark Nova is distilled down to 5 actions, versus like Agricola, where the worker placement spots are added upon each round and create more of a wider selection for you to choose from. It is always 4 or 5 actions with Wingspan and Ark Nova, and thus, and the branching decisions after that, what you do with your 4-powered building action may depend on, where you are in the game and whatnot. And the same applies to Wingspan, where you go along the game, you've placed birds down into your action rows, and depending on your state of the game, perhaps taking the draw bird cards action feels different because of the birds that you've already played and the engine that you can execute versus earlier on in the game. Like that simplicity and streamlined decision branching point is found in both games, which I really do enjoy, and I feel like it makes the game teach a little bit easier to show players, okay, this is all you can do. You can make tougher and more diverse decisions after which, but at least I can point you into these 5 categories to allow you to dive into the strategy a little bit more with each turn and each decision. So Ark Nova, I feel like it's very popular right now, but I think it will increase in popularity and perhaps become very close to the popularity in the widespread audience and population of casual board gamers as Wingspan has. Okay, I have 2 more games here. I'll go through them pretty quick to save on time, but my second to last game is Azul, and my Rosenberg pick is Applejack. So the feeling of tile drafting and placing them in a restrictive type of tableau kind of creates similar vibes for me in Applejack as it does in Azul, where making sure that you place those tiles that you draft in just the right spot, with a little bit of potential for hate drafting as well, kind of creates a similar vibe and experience as I feel in both games. Obviously, Applejack does have a lot more of a mathematical and complicated scoring situation than Azul does. Even though there is some math that is done in Azul, it's pretty simple. If you can get past that in Applejack, I think the overall experience is very similar. And my non-Rosenberg pick is going to be Cascadia again. I think the tile placement and tile building, individual tableau building with tiles, is similar as it is in Azul. And so you can't really go wrong with Cascadia. And then finally, probably the wildest comparisons that I can make is going to be for Gloomhaven. I've talked to a lot of people who have played Gloomhaven, have heard of Gloomhaven, physically as well as digitally. And so how do you draw some comparisons from that campaign-style dungeon crawl to a Rosenberg Euro game? So 2 games actually come into mind here, and once again, these are pretty crazy. But I think if you really enjoy the campaign aspect of Gloomhaven, playing through a narrative, or at least in the sense that, there is a story involved, but if you are kind of going for, this situation feels different than the last situation with the map and with the villains that you're fighting as well, then I think the solo challenges from Ediwa felt like a really good comparison, because if you're doing the solo challenges, they force you in different directions. Kind of in a similar fashion to how Gloomhaven forces you, based off of the scenario, to explore different areas of the game, not only with the mechanisms, the card play, the villains that you fight, but also with the asymmetric players that you have. And that leads me to the second game from Rosenberg that I would recommend, and that would be Caverna, specifically with the first expansion, The Forgotten Folk, which allows you to play the game with asymmetric player powers. And as far as I know, that is the only one of Rosenberg's games that allows you to play with asymmetric player powers from the beginning of the game. I often consider a lot of his games as you acquiring asymmetric powers throughout the game. For example, in Agricola, as you play down your occupations and minor improvements, it gives you certain efficiencies and powers that you can use and utilize during the game for yourself, which creates an asymmetric advantage with everyone else doing the same. But I guess if you want to start with the game and have that feeling of, this is my character, this is what my character excels at, they do have weaknesses as well, then that would create the same feeling and experience that you might find in Gloomhaven if you were willing to jump from Gloomhaven into a more Euro-style experience. Finally, my non-Rosenberg pick would be the living card games like I mentioned before. And of course, there are many dungeon crawling type games that can give you this same feel. Games that I have not played, for example, Oathsworn is a game that has been talked about recently that kind of lives up to the same hype as Gloomhaven does. But for ones that I have played myself, living card games like Lord of the Rings and Arkham Horror, Marvel Champions, etc., seem to share the same similarities in a campaign-driven, cooperative experience that you have with hand management in particular. There is obviously some deck building along the way to prepare for these different campaigns, and of course you do participate in that with Gloomhaven as well. So there are a lot of mechanisms that are shared. Yes, the situations and the scenarios are different, the way that you manage your hand is different as well, but there are a lot of aspects that are shared between these games. So those are the most popular and important games, I think, the most classic games that I can think of, where I have run into when talking to other people who aren't into the board gaming hobby as deep as I am, or especially more experienced with the Euro-style games as I am. And so these are my answers. These are the games that I would turn to first if I were to recommend games that appeal to people based off of this list. Of course, there are a slew of games and many other games that many other people would agree are top-notch and great recommendations. And if so, leave a comment down below saying what games you would recommend if people liked Catan or Ticket to Ride, etc. But for now, thank you for consulting with us, and I hope you have a great day and schedule an appointment with us real soon, and I'll catch you on the next one. Take care.